Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Frontline Club webinar. I'm Lisa Upton, Australia for UNHCR's Head of Communications and Public Affairs. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I extend that respect to the traditional owners of the land from where you are joining us. A special welcome today to members of our board, Australia for UNHCR ambassadors, and our colleagues from UNHCR in Canberra. Let me introduce our special guest, Adrian Edwards. Adrian is UNHCR's regional representative for Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific, based in Canberra. I'm also joined by the leadership team at Australia for UNHCR. Naomi Steer is the founding national director. After 22 years in the job, Naomi has decided that now is the right time to say goodbye. So I'll be asking her to reflect on more than 2 decades of service to refugees. Trudi Mitchell is the Deputy National Director of Australia for UNHCR. Trudi is also the incoming CEO and will officially step into the role next Tuesday. Later in the discussion, we'll hear from Michael Dwyer, the Chair of Australia for UNHCR. Michael, we're delighted that you're able to join us today, and we look forward to hearing from you later. I'm sure, like me, you're looking forward to hearing from our guests about current global trends around displacement, how UNHCR is responding to these trends, and Australia's role. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions of our guests this afternoon. The comment function is closed, but you can post a question in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible in the time that we have. Naomi, we'll come to the current situation in a few minutes, but before we do, I'd like to take you back 22 years to the year 2000 when you started Australia for UNHCR. Can you tell us what was happening then and why you set up the organisation?
Thanks, Lisa, and I'd just like to say hello to everybody. I know lots of friends, new and old, have joined us today. I see lots of familiar names on the response list, so it's just a real pleasure to have you joining me for what is my last webinar today. Going back 20 years, it's like ancient history, isn't it, Lisa, really? But yes, I can remember. Of course, I was extremely young then. But in setting up Australia for UNHCR, it was a decision actually by UNHCR itself and recognising, even in those early days, the need to diversify funding from government to private sector because of the increasing needs of displaced people. And Australia back in 2000, if those of us who can remember it at that far back, you know, it was actually a really positive environment around refugee and asylum space. We, of course, had just led the peacekeeping forces in East Timor. So for many of us in Australia, it was the first time that we'd seen sort of a displacement or refugee issue virtually right on our border and bringing into our homes via the TV screens every night. It was also just before 2000 that the then Prime Minister, John Howard, provided for safe havens for Kosovo refugees to come and live in safety in Australia in regional areas. And just over the last, 2 decades, I've travelled to a number of those areas, and there are still sort of very fond memories and also strong connections between those people who were resettled. So for UNHCR at that time, Australia was seen as, I guess, best in class to some extent around our treatment of refugees and asylum seekers, and obviously also a country that had the capacity to support a private sector venture. But of course, that circumstances, I guess, changed not long after I'd started. And again, in August 2001, when the MV Tampa, the Norwegian vessel, rescued, I think it was over 430 refugees, tried to land in Australian waters, and for first time, as far as I'm aware, a ship in distress was refused landing in Australian waters. And it was really from that point that the whole narrative and politics around refugees and asylum seekers changed.
Given that context that you've just described, what was it like setting up a new organisation at that time?
I think for us, it actually meant that people were interested. I think prior to that, although we had a very strong bipartisan government policy around refugee and asylum seekers, I'm not sure how much thought the general population put into it, but people were very interested in one way or the other. And in the early days, I remember just going to sort of have dinner at people's places, and I was sort of having discussions and arguments on every point. But for us starting out, and I've told this story to staff who I'm sure sort of think of me as the old women in corner. I really was a one-woman band. That being said, I had fantastic friends, colleagues like our chair, Michael Dwyer, our chair, John Boltby, who's with us today, who've been there from the start. And like most small organisations, you really rely on family and friends to get it going. But it was clear that that wasn't going to be sustainable. And it was really when we started talking about the UN and we started talking about what displacement meant that people were interested, even if they didn't know who UNHCR was. And through various trial and error, we landed on really a program which we call face-to-face, and many of our donors and many people joining today might have joined up to support Australia for UNHCR through that, and that was sort of with street-based advocates talking about our work and asking for our support. And that was a real turning point, because it's always been the case when we talk about the needs of refugees one-on-one, we always have had a fantastic response. And the only other thing I'd like to say in terms of that program, it was really important for us because we started employing so many resettled refugees through that program. And in fact, today, 3 of our leaders of that program are in fact refugees. So something I'm very proud that we've been able to support, not just financially, but also providing employment to people here.
Naomi, can you describe the first appeal that you ran?
The first appeal that we actually got money for was an appeal for Afghanistan, and again seems like a ancient history, but it was actually before the US-led international forces. It was before 9/11, and there was very desperate situation for Afghans in camps across the border in Pakistan. And so we ran what was sort of, it sounds like ancient history, a fax appeal. So some people might remember faxes. And it was a very effective way of fundraising. And that was with the support of Ian Chappell, our long-standing special representative and ambassador. And Ian came on board because nobody really knew me. Our copywriter at the time said, if you're going to send this out, you need a name of somebody that people will recognise through contacts. We contacted Ian, who had been outraged at the treatment of refugees after the Tampa crisis, was looking to do something really positive. So it was just the right people at the right time. And so that was our very first appeal, spewing appeals out through the old fax machine.
Naomi, we're going to talk more about Afghanistan later, but how do you feel seeing the humanitarian cycle there come full circle? And how has UNHCR's response changed over these past few decades?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's the sort of humanitarian cycle. When we talk about that, in sort of classic humanitarian terms, you'd think of prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. And unfortunately, Afghanistan, like so many situations that UNHCR is dealing with, it never gets to that stage of recovery. And I think probably over the last 2 decades, we've just seen this multiplicity of crises and old ones like Afghanistan never really dying. And I think the challenge has been, and our High Commissioner, Mr. Filippo Grandi, has spoken about this, as did his predecessor, Antonio Guterres, now the Secretary General of the United Nations. But conflict forces displacement, but it's so much more complex now because of other factors, urbanisation, the huge youth boom, food and water scarcity, which is what we're facing right now in the Sahel, and of course climate change, which now is front and centre of everybody's minds. So I think over the last 2 decades, I've just sort of seen as colleagues in UNHCR and other humanitarian organisations, just the sort of complexity of crises. And Afghanistan, of course, is a very classic example of that.
Thanks, Naomi. You raised climate change there, and Adrian, in a few minutes, I'm going to come to you and get some insights from you. But Naomi, before I do that, I wanted you to maybe reflect on some of your insights. You've seen so many difficult and tragic situations. Can you maybe share a few insights from those experiences?
Well, look, and it's sort of interesting, and I remember one of our donor events where we were hosting the Nansen awardee, Sister Angelique Nameka, who is this amazing heroic nun who lives in Dungu, a remote area of Democratic Republic of Congo on the South Sudanese border. And she has saved single-handedly many victims of the Lord's Resistance Army, women and children who've been kidnapped and really gone through very terrible experiences. But we'd supported her in her program up in Dungu, and then we brought her to Australia on a speaking tour. And I remember at one of those events, one of our donors came to me and said, "Oh, look, I bought a sort of box of tissues. I think it's going to be really tragic." And afterwards she came up and said, "I didn't need that. It was actually inspiring." And of course, it was inspiring because not only is Sister Angelique Nameka inspiring, but we were talking about the positive impact of what support can do. And I think for me, over 20 years, when people say, how can you experience it? Or, and I've been in situations of famine, I've been in situations of enormous displacement, but I'm there because we have the support of Australian donors who really are making a positive impact. And so when you're there, not only just being able to provide resources for basic life-saving support, food, water, shelter, but also longer term support, I think that really, is an enormous gift to ourselves, I have to say. We go in there offering support. The kind of support that we provide, I don't think it's changed, it's increased. I think we would once upon a time have spoken about UNHCR pretty much in emergency terms, and I've spoken about food, water, shelter, because the average time a refugee will be outside their home country or in a displaced situation, 20 years or more. We really are dealing with protracted situations, and I won't talk now, and Adrian might well want to address it too, but it's this gap between emergency humanitarian assistance and longer term development that's been the space where there's been a lot of dialogue and action now supporting refugees in hosting communities who themselves are often the poorest, and that's the sort of reality of where most refugees and displaced people live, in the poorest countries, who need support themselves. So providing infrastructure. When we build a school, it's a school that will educate not only refugee children, but also children of the host community. When we provide medical services, they'll be provided to refugees, but also the host community. And that's a shift certainly from our early appeals and early campaigns 20 years ago.
And of those sorts of projects you've just described, Naomi, which ones are most memorable to you as you sort of step away? Which are the ones that you're going to be thinking about in the years to come?
I think, well, one of the earliest ones we did, and it was around a Safe Mother and Reproductive Health program, was the Safe Mother Birthing Kit. And donors really responded to it because it did really illustrate. Often it's the most simple things that can have a really big impact. And the kit is made up of a plastic sheet for a mother about to give birth to lie down on, some antiseptic for the birth assistant to have clean hands, a razor blade to cut the umbilical cord, a piece of string to tie the umbilical cord, and a small wrap to keep the baby warm after it's born. And this was trialled in refugee camps in Nepal, and where it was used in an emergency setting, it cut maternal mortality rates to nearly zero. I've seen it a lot used in emergency situations. I do stress, and health workers will always say to me, don't rely on that. You must encourage, of course, mothers to go to hospital because that's the safest place to go, and that is right. But in the absence of that resource, I've seen it actually used in hospitals when they have no other sterile equipment or support. And that was just such a simple, compact package. But when you think that is actually saving a mother's life. And we, through our various reproductive health programs in Somalia, in Myanmar, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, literally with our donor support saved, I think, hundreds and hundreds of lives. The other program that I do talk about, a lot about is our computer technology centre that we built in what's called the Deep Field location in Uganda, not far from the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was built in a refugee camp called Nakivale Refugee Camp, which when I first visited had about 50,000 people. It's got now over 100,000 people. It's very spread out over about 84 kilometres. Again, I think what people, and I want our donors to know, when we do this work and work with UNHCR, it's not us just coming in or UNHCR coming in determining needs. It's very much through a participatory process. So I'm always asked by UNHCR and taken to meet with refugee leaders to consult what are the priorities, what does the community need. And in Nakivale at that time, and there was food scarcity because, like right now, food prices were high and the World Food Programme was struggling to meet the needs of people there. So there were serious issues around that. But the refugees were saying to me, of course we need food, of course we need water, of course we need shelter. But many of us have been here for 10 years or more, and we need to be connected and engaged with the world. And, we want our children to have the same opportunities as children everywhere. So we ended up building a secondary school, but we also built a computer technology centre. And why I love this program was because it was, again, a sort of simple concept to provide computer training that would be accredited in the Ugandan system. So people, and they do have freedom of movement in Uganda, unlike many other countries. So people can work if they can find work, and they can study if they can get a place in school or university. But they did get that training, but for the first time they had internet connection. And through internet connection, so many people in Nakivale were able to find and trace friends and families, which they thought they had lost in the trauma of displacement. And the third thing that came out of it was a bank. There was a fantastic refugee who just arrived from Goma. He had a financial background. He came to the computer centre with his resume. He wanted to do some online study. The chair of the computer centre, also a refugee from Kenya, saw his resume and said, look, he's not going to study, he's going to help me set up the bank. And so together they pioneered the first cooperative bank for refugees in Nakavali resettlement, the SACO Bank, which has provided all sorts of microcredit loans and supported refugees with health backgrounds, setting up little health clinics, tailoring, other kinds of businesses. And I'm really proud of the contribution that we did through the original idea of the computer centre and seeing all the other things that have grown out of that.
Thanks so much, Naomi, for sharing those stories. I'll come back to you a little later. This year, we reached a grim new milestone. 100 million people are now displaced around the world. In a moment, I'll bring in UNHCR's regional representative, Adrian Edwards. But first, we're going to take a look at a short film about the massive global challenge we're facing and the things you can do to make a difference.
Let's talk about 100 million people. You have probably heard about the war in Ukraine.
We're standing here directly at the border between Ukraine and Moldova.
Conflict in Yemen, attacks in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Crisis in Syria, Afghanistan, and Ethiopia.
Many Afghans are extremely anxious about what the future holds.
You may have also heard about violence, persecution, and insecurity in other parts of the world, like South Sudan, Myanmar, and Africa's Sahel region. The lack of peace and security in these and other countries around the world has forced a staggering 100 million people to flee their homes and take dangerous journeys in search of safety. But have you also heard about all the communities that welcomed them? Refugees and displaced people who found new opportunities, who have rebuilt their lives and are even helping others? What about refugees who felt safe enough to go home? Even as the number of displaced people continues to rise around the world, solidarity and the commitment to find solutions is growing. And refugees, displaced and stateless people, despite everything, remain hopeful.
Cuando uno tiene deseos, ganas, voluntad, optimismo, creo que no hay obstáculo que pueda pararlo.
For those forcibly displaced, the most fulfilling action can be going home. In 2021, about 5.7 million people voluntarily returned to rebuild their lives and their communities. One sign that peace is a powerful solution. Behind all these numbers are stories of people who have lost so much, but also resilience and compassion. 100 million is not just a number. It is families, friends, and loved ones. It is a devastating milestone. But it is not a refugee crisis. It's a political crisis. It's a failure of humanity to prioritize peace and stability. But it is also a challenge to everyone. What can you do to help people forced to flee? Find out how you can volunteer to help displaced people near you. Donate. Help raise funds for displaced people around the world. Subscribe to our channel to stay informed. Encourage your leaders to do more for displaced people and boost support for the countries and communities that host them. And most of all, advocate for more lasting solutions to displacement and make peace a priority.
Apologies for that little hiccup there. Adrian, great to have you with us this afternoon. UNHCR coordinates humanitarian aid, but the UN Refugee Agency also works with governments to seek political and durable solutions to global displacement. Can you explain how UNHCR is engaging with governments around the world to deal with this situation of 100 million people being displaced?
Lisa, thank you very much for that. And hello, everyone. It's really great to be here this afternoon. To answer that question, what I might look at is a bit of history here, because you heard from Naomi just now of that history over the last 22 years. But go back a little bit further, and I think you start with the point here that refugees are as old as humanity. We've always had refugees. It's not something totally new to us. But just look at what's happened. UNHCR was set up in 1950, 5 years after the end of World War II. And just to recall, at that time, World War II had displaced between 40 and 60 million refugees. The division of Europe into an East and West after World War II had created its own set of new problems and fears of persecution. And as late as 1955, there were still more than 2.2 million refugees under UNHCR's mandate, and these were mostly from the post-World War II period and in Europe. And there were camps even in Europe for displaced people right until the end of the 50s. So if you like, right from the start, we've been given a pretty tough job. And that was part of that job was working with governments to find solutions for these people. And by that, I mean a way out of being a refugee forever. And to answer your question about how are we dealing with this 70 years later, and in the context of today's 100 million people displaced, allow me to say that although we are today a modern organization working in incredibly dynamic, complicated refugee protection context, the fundamentals really have not changed. And what's more, they still work. So what we do, we drive the immediate response to any new refugee crisis by taking the kind of direct actions you saw Naomi speaking about, and just in the video there. And this is about helping people survive and catalyzing a wider international response. This is the bit that's most commonly in the news headlines. But then too, we also work painstakingly with governments, development actors, the business sector, yourselves, others, to bring about the kind of societal and political will needed for solutions. And there's a number of things there. We support people to settle in countries where they are. We help with resettlement of those who can't safely remain where they are. We work in voluntary repatriation. We work on what we call complementary pathways. And these are routes like community sponsorship, refugee study visas, family unification, employment visas, which, though they sound small, collectively add up to quite a big effort. And this work, you heard from Naomi that you can remain a refugee for years, and this work takes years. Countries, including Australia, they have limits on the numbers of refugee places they're prepared to make available each year for resettlement, and wars and conflicts can easily drag on. Afghanistan, as you heard, that's more than 40 years there. In Côte d'Ivoire, for example, peace and stability allowed for UNHCR only recently to recommend cessation of refugee status. And our High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, he was there in Liberia just a few weeks ago in June, traveling with a group of refugees returning home to Côte d'Ivoire. Some of these people had fled there 20 years ago, back in 2002. So I'll come to a conclusion here, but we're saying to governments globally that with 100 million people, we really have 100 million reasons to help more, to redouble efforts to bring about peace, to help refugees better where they are, whether that's here, whether that's far away where they are at the moment, and in countries that are on the front lines of global displacement. So it's a call to step up our game and address this as we really need to.
Adrian, we face complex political situations in many countries. In the UK, the government is trying to send refugees to Rwanda. Can you describe what UNHCR's response to this is?
Well, I was a journalist at one stage in my career, so I'm going to answer this in a little bit as I would as a journalist. UNHCR has been pretty clear in its view that this deal is wrong, and for many reasons. For a country, the UK, that's signatory to the Refugee Convention and has institutions for dealing with asylum claims, to be exporting its responsibility to others really runs contrary to any notion of responsibility sharing. And this makes it damaging to the whole international refugee framework. Secondly, just on a little bit of detail there, if you allow me to speak about it, Rwanda has done actually quite a lot to help Congolese, Burundian refugees, among others. But it doesn't have established systems for dealing with asylum claims. It deals through what we call prima facie refugee recognition, which is how you deal with large numbers of people fleeing conflict. So if we were to try and establish these asylum systems in Rwanda, it would take years. It's really a different ballgame that's being superimposed on Rwanda. and people are really being taken from one situation and put into a worse one. I think a couple of other points, if I may, on that. The UK says its motivation is to save people from these dangerous journeys. And of course, that's great. We don't want anyone to have to undergo a dangerous or risky journey. But one really has to ask whether this is really the sole motivation. If countries want such journeys to end, there are in fact other ways to deal with it. You're talking about people in this context moving through developed asylum systems in Europe before they reach the UK. And I think the very final point there, and this is one that our High Commissioner Filippo Grandi has made, this makes UNHCR's work much more difficult. What do we say to, for example, an African country already hosting thousands or millions of refugees? If they tell us a rich country like the UK is sending refugees abroad, why shouldn't we do the same? So you can see the difficulties there are there. So there's work to be done, and we have to be respectful of the legal and other processes in the UK that are ongoing on this. But it's really, I think, a search to find a better way to deal with these issues.
Adrian, obviously we have a new Australian government in power. What are you hoping for in terms of new government policy?
Well, right now, I think we're still awaiting word on what the government approach is going to be in a number of crucial areas. You know, this includes from resettlement numbers, which we've heard a bit about so far, to detention, to temporary visas, and so on. The Labour platform, as you may know, has a lot of positive elements in these areas, but these are still early days, and we have to wait and see how those kind of things translate out. UNHCR's own policies and positions in relation to here in Australia, maybe they're not headline positions always, but they are pretty clear. We want fairness and protection for asylum seekers arriving here. We want to help Australia to achieve that. We want permanent solutions to be found for refugees to stop people having to live in this permanent impermanence. And we want a number of things too. We want to help bring about solutions for all who are affected by the regional processing, for example, and bringing families together. There's a number of areas and things here that we advocate for pretty much constantly. But if there's one thing that I personally, as a representative here, would love to see, it's the sense of crisis being taken out of questions to do with asylum here in Australia, and a return to recognition that by helping refugees, we really are helping the world. We're doing our fair bit, we're helping ourselves too. Being able and willing to help refugees is something we should all be proud of. Australia rightly should be proud of that too, because it has great traditions in terms of settlement and other areas in this regard.
Thanks, Adrian. Your remit covers Australia, New Zealand, PNG and the Pacific. What are the key issues for our region?
Well, that's one of the problems when you look at 16 countries that we cover and the vast geographic area. Finding the commonality can be quite a search. Each country does present very different priorities. PNG, for example, where you've got quite a lot of violence going on with the election at the moment, that also happens to have quite a large number of refugees, about 11,000 refugees from Papua and neighboring Indonesia. And whereas some Pacific states have very few asylum seekers, broadly speaking, what we want is to ensure that any refugee and asylum seeker arriving in this region does have access to be heard, to have their voices heard, does have access to processes that can determine their claims to asylum, and that ultimately this region can play its role as a model to other parts of the world in terms of some of the good practices seen here.
How much is climate change an issue?
Oh, climate change is a huge issue. And let me just say this, when the UN Refugee Convention was created in 1951, as you might imagine, people had other thoughts on their mind at that time than climate change. However, this does not mean, and I think there's sometimes a misperception in this, it doesn't mean that international refugee law is not changing, evolving to keep up with the times or to deal with the risks that climate poses. Indeed, just in 2020, there was a landmark case before the UN Human Rights Committee in which the ruling was that climate change can indeed present a serious threat to life and that countries must take this into account. So law around climate change is evolving, and it should. None of us can be complacent in this. For now, what we're seeing is that climate change globally is contributing to an increase in displacement risk. In other words, it is adding to the factors that cause this displacement. So as land becomes unusable, people move elsewhere, typically within their own countries. But nonetheless, it can give rise to conflict. And as you know, if you flee conflict, war, or persecution, then in fact you are protected by the Refugee Convention. So right now, the convention is doing its job in this regard, but watch this space. This is an area of constant work and constant worry for us about how we organize to be better prepared, if you like, the world to be better prepared for what is coming, and also to mitigate the risks that are happening already and that are going to unfold further along the way.
Adrian, we've had an audience question. We rarely hear about the plight of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar who've spent years in camps in Bangladesh. Is that something that you could give us a very quick update on?
The plight of the Rohingya is absolutely heartbreaking. As you probably know, we have around 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh and also in other parts of the region, Malaysia and elsewhere, still in a situation which cries out for a solution to be found for it. And at the moment, it's tragically lacking that solution. So work has to go on to try and identify what that might be. When we speak to refugees and our colleagues who work in Cox's Bazar and in the camps that you saw, that in fact I think are in the background to the photo that behind Naomi on the screen there, people still want to return home. We all know that the current context in Myanmar is not conducive to returns, but we have to work to find a way for there's some possibility for people to have lives beyond this and not live in this state of temporary impermanence, of permanent impermanence, if you like, that they risk in the current environment. So that's a situation very, very much on our minds. When you look at the alarming news out of Myanmar at the moment, it's all the more on our minds. And we know too that there are many people, including here in Australia, who come from that background and from that Myanmar context, with whom we try and keep close touch with.
Thank you, Adrian. I want to bring in Trudi Mitchell. As many of you will know, Trudi is our long-standing Deputy National Director and will succeed Naomi as CEO. Congratulations, Trudi. Naomi touched on Afghanistan, and I know you've been in close contact with colleagues on the ground there. Can you give us an update on the situation right now?
Thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you, and also very big shoes to fill for taking over from Naomi Steer, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Yes, let's talk about the Afghanistan situation. Amazingly, in the middle of next month, it will be a year since the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, and we will all remember those images at Kabul airport. I don't think they will ever leave us. Unfortunately, the news with Afghanistan is still really challenging. It's in an unprecedented humanitarian crisis due to the severe economic situation, food insecurity, high levels of poverty, natural disasters, droughts and floods that are exacerbated by climate change, as Adrian has just spoken about, and also the ongoing impacts of the pandemic. So at the moment, there are 3.5 million people internally displaced within Afghanistan, and a further 2 million people who are refugees in neighbouring countries. I think a statistic that really hits home to me is that more than half of the Afghan population, which is 39 million people, is currently dependent on life-saving and essential humanitarian assistance. So the situation is very challenging, and for many of our donors out there, we spoke about last month's earthquake in the southeastern Afghanistan, in the sort of southeastern part of Afghanistan, and unfortunately the impact of that is still ongoing. aside from the loss of life and devastating injury to people, the earthquake has destroyed critical infrastructure, so homes, health facilities, schools, water networks, and this has left thousands and thousands of people vulnerable to further harm. So UNHCR is on the ground, and as Adrian said, UNHCR has been on the ground in Afghanistan for over 4 decades now. It's been in the provinces of Paktika and Khost where the earthquake took place as well, and it's delivering emergency shelter and non-food items, and working as we do in an interagency response. I just wanted to acknowledge the wonderful support our donors gave the Afghanistan crisis last year. We raised $11.6 million, which was one of the highest amounts given to UNHCR outside of governments. And it's something that really shows the generosity of our donors, but also the compassion. And we also raised a further $235,000 for the earthquake situation. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of our donors and supporters for getting behind this situation. Thanks, Lisa.
Trudi, sadly, in the past 12 months, Afghanistan, of course, hasn't been the only crisis. We're also watching a terrible situation unfold in Ukraine. Can you update us on what UNHCR is doing there?
So I find it quite amazing to think again from a time perspective that it's 6 months, almost 6 months since the Ukraine war began. We've seen 14 million people displaced overall, and that's 8 million people internally displaced within Ukraine, and a further 6 million people who have become refugees in neighbouring countries or have fled to neighbouring countries. UNHCR's very active on the ground, again, providing cash assistance, as we know that this is one way that can be immediate help, and also providing relief items and creating safe spaces and referral channels for vulnerable refugees, and also providing services such as legal counselling and information provision. I know that in Europe at the moment it's summer, but the next focus for Ukraine and for UNHCR will be what happens in winter for people who are displaced. And so UNHCR is looking at, how we make sure that we can help Ukrainians at that time. And that's by providing things like cash assistance, rental assistance, helping to repair some damaged homes so that people can stay or go back to their homes if it's safe. So that's the overview of what's happening in Ukraine. And unfortunately, without a political solution, it seems to be this is continuing on, sadly.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Trudi. We know the impact of the Ukraine conflict is having a ripple effect in many areas. We're seeing alarming reports about food insecurity in many countries. Trudi, I'm going to ask you to do something now that's a bit difficult, which is give us a very brief overview of that, because we are going to be doing a lot of work in this area. But I'm also cognizant of the fact we have lots of messages for Naomi, and I want to have enough to get to those. So sorry to ask you to be brief on this, but
that's okay.
Just give us a couple of
Yeah, look, I think what we're seeing is the ripple effects from war and also the impacts of climate change, and it's disproportionately affecting countries that are already facing humanitarian crisis. And we're thinking about Afghanistan, Yemen, and the Horn of Africa. And I'll just have a couple of stats which I will just give you an idea. So Russia and Ukraine are major sources of grain for Eastern Africa. For instance, Somalia imports 90% of its wheat from these countries. And the cost of the food basket in Ethiopia, for instance, has risen 66%. And in Somalia, it's risen 36% in a really short time. And if you're a refugee or an internally displaced person, you just can't can't accommodate anything like that. So there are challenges there, and it's looking like there, with the exacerbation of Ukraine, 50 million people will face acute food insecurity, particularly in Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan and South Sudan. So the situation is very serious, and UNHCR is on the ground helping, but we need funding to make a difference.
Thanks so much, Trudi, and I'm sorry to ask you to keep that so short.
Fine.
That is something we will be talking a lot about in the coming months, and I'm sure we'll have a webinar to look specifically at this issue. I want to move now, a little surprise that we have for Naomi. We, of course, want to recognise your contribution over 22 years, Naomi, and our wonderful colleague Laura has found a lot of footage of you over many years that she's put together. You mentioned earlier in the webinar how much you loved a fax machine back in the day. Well, this film begins with a fax machine.
Start fax.
What you want, baby, I got it. What you need, you know I got it. All I'm asking is for a little respect when you come on. Just a little bit, hey, baby, just a little bit. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, find out what it means to me. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, take F-T-C-T.
No time for any sleep when you're laughing along with me. Got you by my side and we're burning on through the night.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, good.
Good. Have you heard about UNHCR?
Ah, yes, UNICEF.
Yeah, well, we're similar to UNICEF.
You and I, we one desire, playing with wildfire. We're burning on through the night.
It's my pleasure, on behalf of all UNHCR staff in the field and at headquarters, to thank Australia for UNHCR. Happy anniversary.
As I write this down, I feel like myself when I'm on my own. And there's no one else, I can feel it. As the years go by, I am defined by the things I take.
I'm standing here in Lokichokio Airport. Many thousands of refugees continue to come into Kenya.
I'll make it
I'm sitting here in the middle of a very large clearing, one of the many projects that Sister Angeli is running for displaced women.
If you wanna live more, take me to this place alone. She said, if you wanna let go, then let me just take you home. Don't know anything about you, or anything about tonight.
I'm here at Nakavali Secondary School.
You're gonna watch your birds so bright. You're gonna start a war tonight. I'm on the other side.
I'm here in Chakatu Refugee Settlement on the construction site for the Vocational Training Centre. And it's great to see the progress since I last came here.
Already it's fully booked.
Today is a really special day because it's the opening of the Vocational Training Centre. I'm just here in Gambella. I'm here in Inke Refugee Camp. I'm here at Lembo Health Post
Okay, let's do it.
Yep. So we're here.
Standing here. Yeah.
Looking for a light in the dark, lost and alone in the sea. Couldn't find a way through the storm. Then he sang.
Welcome to this special briefing, our fourth Frontline Club virtual event.
Everyone's trying to be seen. Maybe we'll wake up one day and it's just a dream.
The reports are many people had already pre-planned their travel in the event of an invasion. I'm Naomi Steer, the National Director of Australia for UNHCR.
So I saw lots of smiles from you there, Naomi. I hope you enjoyed that. I'd like to welcome Michael Dwyer now. Michael, if you could just switch your camera on, thank you very much. Michael, as you all know, is the chair of Australia for UNHCR, and he would like to say a few words to farewell Naomi.
Thank you, Lisa. On behalf of the board of Australia for UNHCR, I'd like to thank Naomi for 22 years of outstanding service to refugees. Gee, you know, there's so much to say about Naomi. It's hard to do her justice in just a few short minutes. I was reflecting, though, we've had a number of sort of discussions, and our Kate Dundas is our deputy chair of the board. And recently she did a really good job of summing up just some of the things we most admire about our Naomi. So Kate said, Naomi is a force for good in the world and a lover of humanity. She said, we only have to look at what Australia for UNHCR has achieved under Naomi's leadership. Since its inception in 2000, the organisation has raised a staggering $400 million for refugees and displaced people around the world. Kate also observed, and I just love her expression here, that Naomi is wickedly intelligent and laser focused on setting and pursuing a goal. Isn't that true? She has a frustratingly extensive memory and is an adventure seeker to a dangerous extent. Well, I can personally attest to that. I've actually had her as my driver in East Timor, and it is a frightening experience. Through every challenge, however, Naomi has persevered. For more than 20 years, she's used her formidable communication skills to advocate for refugees whenever and wherever she can. She has deliberately, effectively, and fearlessly told positive stories about refugees, you know, the kind of stories that we don't hear often enough. She's reminded us again and again that nobody chooses to be a refugee, that people have a right to seek asylum, and that refugees have an enormous amount to contribute to our society. The Board of Australia for UNHCR has had a very good and productive relationship with our CEO, Naomi. I'd like to share a few words penned by my fellow board member, Peter Shergold. He said, Naomi, you have taught me so much in my time on the board, not just about effective fundraising, but about the subtleties of international bureaucracy. Most importantly, I have witnessed your extraordinary leadership, born of many years' experience and continuing enthusiasm for what is a vital cause. So true, Peter. You know, since Naomi announced her resignation, many supporters have been in touch. And a number of these really resonated with me, so I'd like to read a couple for you now. This comes from Philippa Smith, AM. She says, Naomi, your contribution to UNHCR and the refugee communities has been enormous and hopefully enduring. We will miss your leadership. You should feel proud of the strong, effective and ethical organisation you have established. and many communities you have helped. I'm pleased that Trudi Mitchell is able to take on this vision. Best wishes for your future, as I said, Philippa Smith. The next one comes from Bomaderry, from Anne Christopherson. Dear Naomi, thank you for your many, many years of service as National Director. Most of all, thank you for your strength, your courage, your consistency and your compassion. Best of all, wishes for your next step in life. Kindest regards, Anne Christopherson. And from Margot Porter, a short but very heartfelt message. Dear Naomi, you're a legend. The world says thank you. Best wishes from Margot. Well, while we're very sad to be saying goodbye to such a treasured part of the AFU UNHCR family, I'd like to share some good news with you all. So Naomi isn't saying goodbye entirely to the UN Refugee Agency. I'm pleased to tell you she will continue to play an important role leading UNHCR's 10 national fundraising partners, and no doubt we'll hear more about that in the future. I'd like to finish up with a quote from the Iranian-American novelist Dina Nairi. She wrote, "It is the obligation of every person born in a safe room to open that door when someone in danger knocks." Well, Naomi, your door has always opened when someone in danger has knocked. You leave Australia for UNHCR with our admiration, our love, and our respect. You are not only an outstanding National Director, but you're also my good friend, a friendship that has stood the test of time and will continue long into the future. You go with our thanks, Naomi. Thanks, Lisa.
Michael, thank you. That was a beautiful speech. Adrian, I wonder, again, conscious of the time, but whether you would like to deliver a final message for Naomi, and then I'll throw to Trudi.
Thank you, Lisa. Naomi, you really are a treasure and will be hugely missed, but I'm not going to embarrass you with words of my own. I'll embarrass you on another occasion. But I do have a message for you from someone who couldn't be here to deliver it in person. And it's this. Naomi, I would like to thank you for your tireless efforts over more than 2 decades to raise funds and awareness for refugees and other displaced people around the world. Since its establishment, you have led Australia for UNHCR to become not just a major private sector donor to UNHCR worldwide, but also a global leader in education and advocacy on behalf of displaced people. Your leadership is recognized globally, including your chairing of our Global Partnership Council. Sadly, the need for humanitarian assistance has not been greater, and I thank you for building an incredible organization we can partner with in our common cause to protect and assist refugees and other forcibly displaced around the world. Thank you, Naomi. It's been an outstanding 22 years of helping refugees, and I wish you all the very best for the future. Yours, Filippo Grandi. Thank you, Lisa.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you, Adrian. And Trudi, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm mindful we've got 1 minute to go, but I just wanted to say on behalf of the team at Australia for UNHCR, thank you so much, Naomi, for your leadership, for your vision. And it's been such a great pleasure to work with you over the last, I think it's 6.5 years now. I've learnt so much from you, and it's wonderful to know that you're staying in the family. So I can have you on your mobile phone on hot dial. So we'll do that. But now we've got a little video that we have other people who wanted to say thank you as well. So we might just go to that. Thanks, Lisa.
Wonderful Naomi, thank you for 22 years of standing with refugees. The world is a better place with you in it, and I feel blessed to be able to call you my friend.
Naomi sees refugees' potential, and she works hard to give them that little push to help them show the rest of the world that potential. She was involved in my scholarship that helps me study filmmaking, which I truly love. And for that, thank you, Naomi, for believing in me.
There are many things I admire about Naomi Steer's work with the refugees, but one of the main ones has been her ability to lead a team and have them follow her. Naomi, all the best for the future, and I hope everything works out.
22 years of global impact and being a force for good in our world. I want to wish you the very best for this new adventure and thank you for your amazing impact and the legacy that you leave behind at Aid for You.
Dear Naomi, thank you for all the work that you have done for refugees. It has been an honor and privilege working with you over the last few years. I hope we keep in touch, and good luck with your new chapter in life.
Naomi, sending you a heartfelt congratulations on such a remarkable and inspirational career as a humanitarian, as a role model, and just as a nice, salt of the earth human being. A person's true wealth is the good they do in this world. Thank you for your goodness, thank you for your friendship, and thank you for being my mentor.
Hi Naomi, congratulations on 22 amazing years of bringing people together and raising awareness for such important and timely causes. It's been wonderful working with you and really wishing you a beautiful journey ahead.
Hi Naomi, the day's finally come. I've always thought of you as the epitome of a woman on a mission, both metaphorically and literally. And I wish you all the very best for the next fabulous chapter of your life. All my love, Kate.
Naomi, I am so glad we have met 11 years ago. Thank you so much for appointing me as the special representative. Thank you for all of your supports and guidance. All the best with your new endeavor, and I am going to miss you very much.
It is just after 5 o'clock, but Naomi, it would be remiss of me not to give you the final word. There have been questions coming in about what your plans are after this, and unfortunately we don't have time to get to those, but you need to have the final word.
And you know I'm always brief in what I say, Lisa, so everyone can go and get a cup of tea. No, look, really, I'm glad I didn't have to speak immediately after that beautiful video that Laura had made. It was like my life flashing before me, my life of Australia for UNHCR, and I was really moved, which I am. It's been an absolute privilege to lead Australia for UNHCR over 22 years, and I think I've said this before, to work in the philanthropic space is an amazing experience. Philanthropy, the word comes from the Greek word philos, which means love of humanity. And, you know, that is all of us here today, you know, who are contributing to that. I'm not going to talk a lot, but I do want to thank, obviously, the board, my chair, Michael Dwyer. As Michael has said, we've worked together for so many years now. I was on his board, he was CEO, and then we swapped, and it's been a wonderful partnership. And he, along with other board members, have walked with me every step of the way in building A4U into what it is. The amazing staff. Trudi, I'm not going to take umbrage at the big feet comment. They're not that big. Very petite, you'll be okay. But I do want to say, you know, I'm really fortunate to have such an amazing team. Trudi as deputy, you know, as a successor, I'm really proud that we have somebody so capable from within the organisation who will be taking over and leading it in an exceptional way. Deborah O'Neill, who I've worked with for 20 years, and I know, Deborah, you had a hand in that video. I can just see it. I don't know, but you've tried to make me look better than I am. It's a hard job. I think it's a sort of history of bad hairstyles, maybe. But Deborah, you know, I love you as a friend and colleague, and you know, we've had so many wonderful experiences together, and I'll always treasure that. And of course, to my wonderful senior management team, everything that we achieve, we achieve together. There was one question you were going to ask but didn't have time. Who inspires me? It's obviously the organisation. It's very much the donors, you know, everybody here today. You know, when I first received my very first cheque from a donor for $25, you know, and it just, as I held that and thought, this is from somebody I don't know, giving me funds to help somebody neither of us know, thousands of kilometres away, but, you know, truly fulfilling that sort of love of humanity and service, you know. And now we're about 100,000 donors strong, which is amazing from that first one check of really an amazing community of people supporting each other. And of course, the final inspiration have been, but not the least, is the refugees that I have met in my work and displaced people who have been truly inspiring. And through technology, which has been the big change over 20 years, I've been able to keep in contact with so many people in so many ways that I've met on my travels. If I only say two things: the power of women. I think I'm really proud that there's a lot of great men behind the Women of Australia for UNHCR. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Paul Beckman. Thanks, Varen and everybody. But we are a really great and strong team of women. And I think that's really appropriate, given that 80% of refugees are women and children. And as I've often said, gender is very much an issue of displacement also. And I have met so many strong and resilient women in my travels as UNHCR staff, as displaced people who, you know, have just been an absolute inspiration. I wanted to just to finish on a beautiful story by one of an amazing young woman, Adut Dao Atom. Adut arrived here from Kakuma refugee camp as a young woman and became our very first youth representative, together with Sophie Weldon. And Adut told this story of when she was in Kakuma. At the time, there were thousands of the so-called lost children from the Sudanese war who all arrived in Kakuma unaccompanied, literally with nothing. And then they were provided with some food, some shelter, some support. And as Adut tells the story, you know, we asked, who is giving us this support? And we were told it's UNHCR. And as she says, so I asked, can I meet UNHCR? And then, of course, she realised that, in fact, as she says, UNHCR is all of us coming together to support each other and support the displaced people of this world. So on that note, I really want to thank everybody involved. I will really treasure today. And this webinar, it's been very special for me, but as I really treasure the last 22 years of what's been an extraordinary journey. Thank you.
Naomi, thank you so much. And I've just spotted a comment from somebody in the audience who's, thank you, Kerry Wright. She's written, what a woman, what an organisation, so many lives impacted positively. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this Frontline Club webinar. And thank you, of course, to our guests, Adrian Edwards, Michael Dwyer, Trudi Mitchell, and Naomi Steer. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye.